So hello, everyone. My name is Ed Mahan. I'm an investigative reporter here at Spotlight PA and your moderator for tonight's event. Thank you all for spending your Thursday evening with us. We've been looking forward to tonight's discussion. For those of you who are new to our programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom producing investigative and public service journalism about state government and urgent statewide issues. We can't do any of this work without you, our readers and donors who support us in numerous ways. You can learn more about us on our website, spotlightpa.org. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow for those who could not join tonight. You can join our discussion by submitting questions during the event. You can do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions already. We will try to get to as many of them as possible toward the end of our program. So I've been reporting on challenges within the childcare industry for several years. Back in February 2020, I had two young kids in childcare, one at a childcare center, another who went to someone's house for before and after school care. It felt like a lot to juggle back then. The next month, we all know what happened. COVID came to Pennsylvania and it had a huge impact on many aspects of our lives, including childcare. In the months and now years that followed, I reported on hundreds of providers that closed, a big drop in enrollment for a program designed to help low-income families, struggles to hire workers, long wait lists, proposed legislative solutions that stalled, and more. We're going to talk about all of these issues tonight. The questions we have received in advance have been great. There were dozens and dozens of them, and we have some great panelists to help us answer them. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Senator Judy Schwenk.
Thank you, Ed. Good evening, everybody. I'm State Senator Judy Schwenk, and I represent the 11th District here in the Commonwealth, which is wholly contained in Berks County. And my interest in childcare, I serve on the Early Learning Education Caucus. I was co-chair, and I'm also a co-chair of the Women's Health Services. And I am an individual who, like Ed, had experiences with childcare, albeit long, long ago, and it still bothers me that we have not fixed this situation, whether it's here in Pennsylvania or nationally. So I'm very, very interested in trying to make improvements here.
All right, thank you so much. All right, and Jen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Ed. Hi, everybody. I'm Jen DeBell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association for the Education of Young Children. And our organization is a statewide nonprofit membership organization of over 3,000 early childhood care and education professionals. And we're focused on being an effective voice for high quality early care and education. So we do that through policy and advocacy work at both the state and federal levels, and also provide learning opportunities and supports to professionals in the field. And I also just want to mention we are proud to be a principal partner of the Start Strong PA nonpartisan childcare advocacy campaign. Happy to be here with you all tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Jen. And Gina, if you can introduce yourself to the audience.
Good evening, everyone, and I would like to thank you, Ed, for inviting me to participate in this. A very essential attention to the crisis we are living through here in Pennsylvania and across the nation, as was said. And I feel as though I am representing thousands of Pennsylvania early childhood educators being on the panel. So I would like to thank you for that.
All right, thank you so much. And so, Gina, you're at a child care program in Schuylkill County. I guess if you can tell us about why you decided to work in the child care industry in the first place.
Well, that's kind of funny. 34 years ago, I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I couldn't find at that time really good quality, affordable childcare while I went to school. It was very difficult. So after I graduated, I was offered a job at a childcare preschool program, very tiny at the time. And it was ideal because I could take her with me. You know, I was able to take my daughter with me free of charge at that time. And we still continue that one benefit that we have free childcare for our staff. So that's how I began this. I never imagined I would still be here 34 years later.
Wow.
But I love it.
That's great. That's great to hear. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect staff recruitment and retention at your center?
In one word, destroyed. Um, since COVID, our programming has dropped in half. Our staff has dropped by a third. It has affected us in many, many ways, as so many have attested to. So it has been, number one, destructive and expensive for families. It's a broken business model at this point. We
Yeah.
cannot sustain ourselves.
And Jen, last time I spoke to you for a story, you talked about how the childcare industry is still in crisis mode. Can you elaborate on what specific challenges persist, despite the influx of federal stimulus funds and despite the time since the pandemic began?
Sure. So we have a crisis because childcare programs can't retain and recruit teachers, and that's causing them to have to close classrooms or close altogether in some cases. And ultimately, that's impacting working families because the crisis is shrinking the supply of childcare that they need. When we look at the crux of the problem, it's really the extremely low compensation in the childcare sector. The Independent Fiscal Office reported that childcare staff are paid on average $15.15 an hour in Pennsylvania. And because of that, childcare earnings fail to meet the cost of living in every single Pennsylvania county. And many childcare staff rely on government healthcare coverage, SNAP to put food on the table for their families. And national and Pennsylvania surveys that have been conducted of childcare directors back this up. Directors consistently tell us the number one reason they lose staff or can't fill positions is because the pay is too low in the sector. So the one-time money that was available to help buoy the childcare sector during the pandemic has long ago dried up, and we really need sustainable funding to help fix the problem.
And what are some ways to measure this crisis? Since the coronavirus pandemic began, some providers closed, others opened. How many do we have now compared to 2020?
Yeah, so we at Start Strong PA, we track the crisis in a few ways. Certainly, we look at the state data around the number of childcare providers that we have. As of September 17th, and kind of looking back to the pandemic, there's been a net loss of over 600 certified childcare providers. And in addition to that, I can share that Start Strong PA's own surveys, and the most recent one showed how bad the staffing crisis is. The most recent results that we have had about 677 providers respond, and it showed 731 closed classrooms, 3,000 unfilled positions, and worst of all, the survey indicated that if people were fully staffed, they could serve 16,000 more children. So keep in mind, that was only about 10% of the licensed providers at that point in time. And just think about how those numbers would look extrapolated across the whole childcare industry in Pennsylvania. So we're actually conducting another survey right now so we can get more recent data to see how things are going. The first set of data that came in, it seems pretty similar. But in addition, I do want to flag too, we look at broader ramifications of the crisis. So one of our partners, Ready Nation, did a report on the impact to working mothers and the economy because of the childcare crisis, reporting it at $2.4 billion. And most of all, moms kind of noted the problem with accessing childcare as their top issue and noting disruption in their work because of programs facing the staffing shortage. So I think the data really demonstrates we have a capacity problem.
All right. And as I mentioned, we had so many great audience questions. Brianna asked us, and this I'm going to ask Gina about this. How can centers attract and retain teachers without proper funding to pay workers what they are worth? So Gina, how are you dealing with that question that Brianna raised?
We have tried many resources to obtain staffing after COVID, during 2020 when we all came back to work. Indeed, the newspapers, online, so many different avenues to try and get staff, just people to walk through the door. And I suggest Indeed or any of those others that you pay for, those services you pay a lot of money for, we found that we would we would find someone who's interested, schedule the interview, and they would never show up. I'm assuming they were still on unemployment. I really don't know. But after 2 years of paying for those services and not having much of any success in obtaining staff, we stopped paying for that. Facebook has actually allowed us to advertise free of charge and has gotten us a few. And actually, some of the centers most recently that have closed or dropped some of their staff, we were able to obtain some very good and 2 staff members, sadly, because other centers have closed or diminished classrooms.
Wow.
So it's
And
been a real struggle.
yeah, and Jen, you talked about, I mean, the pay. I mean, is that the key barrier to recruiting and retaining childcare workers? And how is, wage competition in other industries affected that in recent years?
We hear the definite biggest barrier is low compensation. So when staff receive very low wages and often don't have benefits on top of it, it's hard to keep and recruit people. Gina said it perfectly. This is a broken business model. The government doesn't pay providers for the actual cost of the service for the children that are subsidized, and providers don't want to ask the private pay parents to pay more. So that's why we need the government investment. And your question about wage competition, that's definitely had a negative impact as well. After the pandemic, we saw significant increases in pay in other sectors. So you've all seen the rates for like fast food or big box stores increase, and they're often well above what the average is for a childcare teacher. And when you think about it, a lot of those jobs require much less skill than caring for and educating our youngest children. In addition to that, we also see the teachers in the early childhood space who have the same degrees and certification that kindergarten teachers have. They'll leave and go work in the public school system because they can be paid better and get better benefits that way as well. So too often what we hear is, I love working with young children, but I'm leaving this industry because I have to take care of my own family. So for people that are so critical in setting our kids off to a healthy start and are the workforce that supports every single other one and makes the economy run, we're losing them, and we're losing childcare capacity that helps working families. We need to recognize the important work that they do.
And then, Spotlight PA, state government, we have a huge focus on that. Senator Schwank, you're co-chair of the bipartisan Early Childhood Education Caucus in Harrisburg. And in the spring, you were advocating for support for the early childhood education workforce to better stabilize and meet the demand for childcare and pre-K services for working families. So can you talk to us about what ultimately was signed into law in the state budget, and was it enough?
Well, we certainly didn't reach our goal on the 284 million. In fact, that wasn't addressed at all. What we did see was that the child care services line item of 26.2 million, it was budgeted at 26.2 million, which basically is cost to carry. It was an increase, but really in order to draw down federal resources, which our state has done for many, many years, rather than investing state dollars into childcare. That was a piece of the budget. And there was also an increase, a 5% increase to pre-K counts and a 3.1% increase to Head Start. But those two programs they're not childcare. They're educational programs. So we did not address, unfortunately, the issue of investing in our childcare workforce.
Okay, and Jen, same question for you. Just, I mean, from your perspective as an advocate, what stood out to you about this state budget that did pass?
So just building off what the senator said, yep, cost to carry is important. Certainly, we don't want to lose what we have. Pennsylvania also received funds from the federal government, which they have to spend on childcare. So the Child Care and Development Block Grant, or CCDBG, is how we refer to it. Those dollars were actually appropriated in the final budget and will allow for a subsidy rate increase for childcare providers starting January 1st. That's a positive. That increase will help providers who participate heavily in the subsidy system with inflationary costs that they're experiencing. We know that rent, utilities, insurance, the cost of all those things is going up. But we know it's not enough to address the childcare crisis around staffing statewide. I'll also add that the General Assembly and the administration agreed to a new tax credit that passed, and that is focused on businesses who decide to support their employees' childcare costs. And that's supposed to begin with the 2025 tax year. That comes on the heels of 2 prior budgets where a new state childcare tax credit for families was established and then expanded in the following year. And tax credits are great for addressing family affordability, and they're important, but they're only effective when parents can actually access care. So for us, what the budget failed to do was really address the heart of the childcare crisis and get at this recruitment and retention problem. We need to address the capacity in the first place to make sure families can access childcare. And so that's why we at Stretch Strong PA have proposed an initiative that will cost $284 million to provide a recruitment and retention program so that we can make sure programs are staffed up and can serve families.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about that. So the 284 million, I believe that'd be annually tailored to recruitment and retention. Can you talk about where did that number come from exactly, and why do you believe it's necessary?
Sure. So we actually developed our proposal and looking at what other states were doing. We honed in on a few that started providing a monthly payment to programs per employee that were focused on recruitment and retention. This is a national issue, and other states are starting to step up to address it. So we looked at other states' ranges of the payment they provided per month and considered those amounts, and they tended to range in the $300 to $500 range, and kind of looked at that against the number of childcare staff we had in Pennsylvania. So we estimated, based on the data we have available to us, that there were about 53,700 childcare staff, and put forth a proposal of 440 a month. And that, if you do the multiplication, takes you to the 284 million. Ultimately, we recognized their estimates, and you'd have to see what the final number of employees would be that would apply to dictate the final per month amount. But that's kind of the thinking behind it. So to give a little more detail on the proposal, we'd be looking at providing that per monthly amount to childcare employees, and it would apply to childcare centers, group childcare homes, and family childcare, which is really important. We want to make sure it would apply to programs that at least have a subsidy agreement with the Commonwealth and have that commitment to serving our lowest income families. But that actually applies to about 90% of childcare providers across the state. We want it directed at the staff who are actually working with the children, because we know that's where we have the staff retention problem. And like other states, we'd like to give some flexibility to programs to decide how to spend it, recognizing it has to be on recruitment and retention efforts. So we've put forward that would allow them to spend the funds on hiring and retention bonuses, wage increases, or benefits like healthcare and retirement that they think could help keep their staff and attract people to their programs. So the idea is to get a sustainable source of funds to keep staff, recruit staff, and then keep the classrooms open for families. And I'll just end by saying this is a proposal that is being recognized beyond the childcare sector. There were over 50 local chambers and economic development organizations that have supported funding for recruitment and retention. There is a bipartisan, bicameral group of legislators who recognize the need to invest in this. So we're really hopeful moving forward that the administration and General Assembly can work together and prioritize addressing the staffing crisis so more families can access childcare.
And Senator Schwank, you've voiced support for that 284 million proposal for childcare worker recruitment and retention. Can you share your insights on why this funding is so critical, especially in this current economic climate?
I've been visiting daycares in my district and in other districts as well, across the state, and also been in forums similar to this, where we've heard directly from providers like Gina exactly what they're facing. And they will tell you, we're going to close a toddler room, or we're going to close, part of our, our availability in terms of bringing children in, simply because we don't have staff available. We cannot hire people. We simply can't find them. This is really hard work. It's wonderful and rewarding work, but when you watch these teachers in action, you surely understand that there's a lot of responsibility there. And to be clear, I believe that childcare is a learning environment as well. all, it most certainly is, although I think you could classify pre-K and Head Start a little bit differently because of the way they're structured. But so we didn't meet the mark. I think one issue for us in terms of getting there in the future is I feel that we need to get to the administration, to the Shapiro administration, and ask them to incorporate this in the governor's budget address. We need to impress upon them how important this is to these families, to our workforce. As Jen mentioned, we have plenty of studies that tell us specifically how much, this is costing us billions of dollars, over $6 billion, because of people not being able to get to work, not, for employers not being able to hire a sufficient quantity of workers, for a whole host of reasons. Childcare is directly linked to our economy. So we've got to try to make the case with those legislators, that all my legislative colleagues, as well as the administration, very early in the budget process or before it, so that we can get them on board. That's how I plan to attack it this year.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you just talked about the importance of getting it in that budget address, in the budget proposal. So I was going to ask you, what are the biggest hurdles to getting enough bipartisan support in Harrisburg? And is it getting enough attention on it? Is that one way?
I think that's part of it, Ed, but $280+ million is a big number. And so we really have to make the case, and we have to have a whole host of supporters behind us to do that. So parents, business owners, we see now, for example, almost all of our state or local chambers of commerce have signed on to a state effort to support quality childcare and early learning. They certainly recognize that it's an issue. That message certainly has to get to legislators, and the case has to be made that this is an investment, not just a cost, but an investment. And as I think Jen mentioned too, at least 18 other states are already doing something similar to this. So Pennsylvania wouldn't be an outlier to do it. Maybe we could be leading the charge in terms of helping to make this happen.
And Gina, in written testimony to the Center for Rural Pennsylvania in February, you shared a letter from an employee who planned to leave due to low wages. How common is this experience, and how are you managing the effects of staff turnover on the children and families you serve?
It is extremely frequent that we are seeing people leaving the industry for the very reasons that all of you have shared: the low income, the burnout. We don't have staff today. Somebody called in sick, so would you please stay 12 hours? We have to cover someone else. Could you please work additional shifts and responsibilities? It's burnout as well as the low income. And we are managing it in ways that we have become very creative with. Unfortunately, we have lost programs, so we're able to take some of those staff and utilize them in other areas. But it's become very difficult. Early childhood education needs to be the focus. It is not simply the child care aspect. We are early childhood educators. So much of a child's base, therefore their formal base in life, their start, stems from those early years. It is imperative to focus on financing and investing in those areas. And it's becoming more and more difficult, and more people are getting out. 8 centers in our county have closed since 2022. It's become, as I said, a crisis and a business model that is failing miserably. And we only have a certain amount of monies that we could charge the parents because they cannot afford anymore. And it's become unmanageable.
Yeah. And Senator Schwenk, I mean, there's been discussion tonight about chambers of commerce getting behind, some of the initiatives. How do you see the issue of childcare intersecting with broader workforce and economic challenges in Pennsylvania? How are businesses impacted when parents can't access affordable care?
Quality child care is foundational to the support. It's what's holding up our workforce in so many cases. As we know, almost every family there needs to be two earners. The old model of, one parent staying home is a luxury that most families can't afford any longer. Businesses will tell you that, it's finding employees is difficult. And they often talk about, how they're trying to make sure that they do everything they can in terms of benefits, salary, but sometimes they just don't seem to think about childcare. I don't know why it's just not talked about enough in terms of helping business leaders to understand how critical this is to their bottom line. And Jen talked about the tax credit that was added to, actually it was in the tax code, not in the budget. That was legislation that was introduced. And I'm really hopeful if we promote that correctly, we can really get business leaders on board, similar to how they do for EITC, for educational tax credits, that they see this also as an avenue, as a way to help employees, but also reduce their tax burden too. We need incentives for them as well as we do for the parents to help get them on board. The value is there. We have to continue to tell them that.
Yeah. And Jen, we have an audience question from Karen GT. Karen GT asked, how do you create policies that address both the supply and demand side of the childcare crisis? And I think you've talked about that a little bit tonight, but so if you can maybe expand on that and maybe talk about some of the tax credits and the limitations of those as well.
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, we've passed a child care tax credit based off of the federal one for families, I think 3 budgets ago, expanded that credit. Now we have the new credit for businesses that'll be starting up. Those are demand side solutions and help with the affordability side of childcare. But as I mentioned, they're not addressing the other side of this, the supply problem. And at the end of the day, if you don't have enough childcare for parents, they might not even be able to use that tax credit because their child might not have a place to go to childcare. So you need to address them hand in hand. And we've passed these tax credits. They exist. Families can utilize them. Senator, I think you make a really good point, like to make sure everybody knows that they're out there and that they're out, parents are eligible for these things, that businesses, when the new one starts up, that they're well aware of that. But we have to start addressing the supply side as well, or there's not going to be the capacity to serve all of the working parents that need it. We already hear regular stories about parents, getting on multiple waiting lists at programs because they can't find childcare.
Yeah. And, I mentioned all the audience questions we received, a lot of people voicing sort of similar frustrations. Sean T asked, and this is for Senator Schwenk, what's missing in our efforts to urge lawmakers to do more? Ashley S wanted to know, quote, actionable ways to gain policy traction on this issue. It seems to be ignored. What's your response to Sean and Ashley?
I feel that we've got more work to do. I think in the past few years with the, the Start Strong effort, that is really starting to get some traction across the state. And we're building coalitions with providers, in rural areas, in urban areas, suburban areas. And if we can, get this statewide effort of people that will reach out to their legislators, I believe we can get something done. It's easy for me to say, but I know for parents, it's not so easy for them to necessarily write a letter to a legislator or to, reach out to them. But perhaps, providers can invite legislators to come to their centers, like has been done with me. Every week, practically, I'm getting an invitation to visit another center, and I'm learning more and more about how important this is. If I didn't know before, I certainly do now. We have to do those same efforts for our legislators. Some of them feel, well, is this an expansion of government? Are we overspending? I would say to them, and I think the argument can be made from both, from all aspects of who needs, a good childcare industry available to us, is what's the alternative if we don't have this? What are we failing to do as a society in terms of making sure that our children get the highest quality learning environment? Gina talked about those 0 to 3 stage of, the development of a child. It is so critical, and those children turn out to be our future workforce as well. So we have to think of this as an investment. We've got to make the case to my colleagues. This is an investment. And I think I read in the chat, and I've said this myself, it's almost like public school. And the history of how public schools were developed in the Commonwealth and throughout this country. Maybe we must, I think, have to start thinking of this as a common good. Childcare is something that we need to be providing as a government in terms of programs that our constituents, people need.
Yeah, so if you're an individual listening at home and you care about this issue, if you are a provider, inviting a lawmaker, if you are just an individual writing a lawmaker, that is something actionable they can and should do.
It's tried and true. It sounds like, oh boy, but it actually works. It's hard not to go into a childcare center and be charmed or to understand exactly, what these providers are up against.
Yeah. And then just we have another question that was just, how do you plan to advocate for this issue in the context of a divided legislature and with competing budget priorities such as K-12 education? We all know that's a huge issue for a variety of reasons we don't have to get into here, but that's a huge issue. So yeah, how do you plan to make this a priority?
I'm glad you brought up the fact of, the big push we put in basic education funding this year. To a certain degree, this is just my theory, I think it took a little of the air out of the room. There was such a big focus on that in the budget that some other priorities perhaps, couldn't surface. And I think that investing in childcare and early learning would be something that we could do in the upcoming year that would be able to get the attention. Again, I think we have to start at, we've got to start with the budget address and make sure that there's an understanding within, and I think there is within the administration. I think they're receptive to the idea, but we've got to bring them to the table as well as legislators.
And Gina, what would you say to lawmakers hesitant to increase funding for childcare?
We are the foundation, part of the foundation of this economy, and in our county, our state, and our nation. The investment, as Senator has said, they are the future of our country. We are raising the future of our country. Early childhood educators are working in a professional environment, in a profession that has been ignored and misunderstood for many, many years. As she mentioned, it took the schools a long, long time to be looked at and observed as a profession, as a vital part of society. And that is where childcare is now. Early learning programs for every family, every working family should be able to obtain quality childcare that is accessible and that is maintained above and beyond the general standards. And that is what our facility is. Many others in the state are that star for quality. And people need to understand that those quality facilities need to be reimbursed and maintained and invested in.
And can you talk about maybe some examples to people, the day-to-day operations, how this funding impacts your ability to operate day to day?
Well, day to day, the loss of programming is tremendous. We could be providing services for 40 more preschool age students, ages 3 to 5, if we had staff. An entire room sits empty. Another area where we have lost our staff and that we have dropped our programming is in before and after school care. Almost daily, I get calls for all of these, and I must put them on a waiting list, and I must tell them, please contact your senator. Start letting them know how frustrating it is for you as a working family to find quality programming for your children, both school age and of course the early learning programs. It is tremendously hard. So our program would be tremendously influenced and added to with investment, that we could provide staffing and more programs, quality programs that offer all the meals that are also included to our families. We could add so many more slots, we could provide services for so many more families with funding.
Yeah. And then I want to turn to some of the great audience questions we have now. I think the first one is from Megan. I'm going to ask this of you, Jen. Do you have a suggestion for how childcare providers can have their voices be heard?
Sure, there's a lot of ways. Some have been mentioned. You can invite legislators into your program. You can, if you are interested, go to startstrongpa.org. We have a toolkit that can help you advocate, from writing letters to participating in action alerts, to sharing your story. As Gina just explained her experience. We're always looking for providers to tell their personal stories. Get your parents to tell their story if they sat on a waiting list for your program and what that felt like for them, or if you had to close a classroom and how that impacted them in their work. Going to some childcare providers have come with us to the Capitol to talk to their legislators there. So there's a variety of ways to make your voice heard. And it's most important you tell your stories. And again, that the families are telling theirs, that the businesses then childcare tell those stories. So we're here to help you. Please get in touch.
And then Jackie G asked, what are solutions for rural areas? Can you address the challenges in rural areas versus urban and suburban ones? Anybody want to take the first stab at this one?
I'll jump in to start. I actually saw a comment in the chat too about when I noted the average wage was $15.15 an hour, and that a lot of people are experiencing wages lower than that. And I think I've often heard wages lower than that in rural areas. So just want to note that is an average. And I've heard wages as low as $11 an hour still in rural areas in particular. I think in some ways the government investment is all that more important in those areas. There's actually some communities in Pennsylvania that have been able to get greater business investment. For instance, York County, I'll give a shout out to them. Some business leaders got together and actually invested in trying to boost wages for childcare teachers. But in more rural areas, that those types of things are a lot more difficult. And what happens, those things are great for the counties that have that ability and the willpower to do it, but it's not equitable across the Commonwealth. That's why we need the government intervention. The other thing I mentioned about our proposal that I think is important that helps rural areas is we would include family childcare. We know that in rural areas, family childcare can be helpful because there just might not be the demand for like a center in certain areas. Family childcare can also be helpful for non-traditional hour work. We hear that as a concern in the business industry quite a bit. Just saw a legislative hearing where the manufacturing sector mentioned non-traditional hours. So those are just some initial thoughts I had in reaction.
Gina, I mean, you're in a rural area. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Most definitely. I would consider our area more of a suburban area. It is not exactly rural, but the economic area of Schuylkill County is most certainly on the lower end. And unfortunately, as a child care provider, again, we can only charge so much to our families. They cannot afford to be charged any more for our services. They simply can't afford it. And our staff can simply not afford to be paid $13 an hour and sustain their families and themselves. And unfortunately, some of the areas of, a lot of people will say, well, you're not a certified teacher. You people are not certified teachers. Well, what incentive is there to become even an associate degree teacher if there's no higher income available? Why would you invest in that or go through some of the requirements to obtain these things if there's no financial goal for these things? So it's certainly difficult.
All right. And Senator Schwank, I know there's Berks County has plenty of urban areas, plenty of suburban areas, but if you want to weigh in on this as well.
On the rural issue, well, just like so many other things we're learning, I also serve on the Center for Rural Pennsylvania, and we're learning how, how sparse some services are. It's certainly childcare, but it also may be finding a food market that is, within 25 or 30 minutes of your home. So it is a critically important issue in rural PA as well, and something that we actually took a look at. That's where I met Gina, and she testified at that particular hearing. And it didn't sound much different from when we had folks that came from urban and suburban areas too. There's some of the very, very same issues, but from the parent side, it may be harder even yet to find a center that, that you can send your children to, and forget about an infant if, because those spots are so difficult to find in many cases. I certainly have talked to young parents or people who said, I called when I knew I was pregnant to try to get a slot, and I couldn't get into the one that I specifically wanted to. So they're scrambling around trying to find a place. This shouldn't be so hard. This is a big fail, honestly, as a society and as a government, that we don't understand the importance, the value of this aspect of, of our economy. I think it's, again, it's going to take a little time, but I think we can make the case for this. I'd also want to add that this isn't just about working people. It's also people who are trying to, enter the workforce in terms of training or higher education, whatever it may be, that they often don't have access because they may not be employed to some of the it's a little bit more difficult for them to be able to have the funding to be able to afford high quality childcare as well.
And we have some live questions as well. Johanna asked, what do you have to say when a middle class family needs to pay as much as their mortgage for a monthly cost of childcare just so we can go to work to keep the workforce afloat? What can we do to fix this? I'll let Senator Schwank if you want to weigh in first.
I'm sorry. Again, I think this is something that we have to say, we will invest in childcare as a state government across the spectrum, from family care to, childcare centers, as well as, we talk about universal pre-K and, just Head Start. Those are very well-known programs to legislators. I think we need to be able to make the same case for across the spectrum. Again, I don't want to get into that problem of thinking that it's not education. It is. It absolutely is when you start with high quality childcare, for sure. But we've got to impress upon legislators that this is an essential service.
Yeah. And we have another question from Linda asked, what, if anything, is being done to help providers with additional costs associated with all of the regulations imposed on them? So, Gina, can you talk about some of the costs associated with regulations that you have to deal with?
I most certainly can. And at our center, we provide, well, let's start with getting somebody to walk through the door. I would like to work in your center. What does it take? It takes approximately $50 in background checks, and there are 4 of them. I'm thinking it could be one, your fingerprints, not 4 different background checks that cost X amount of dollars. You will need a physical exam every 2 years with a TB test initially. And our center is very generous in paying for some of the training requirements, the mandated reporter training you need to walk through the door. You will need first aid training, water safety, fire safety. And unfortunately, the regulations have become more stringent and more taxing and financially burdening to centers, because since COVID, they have doubled the required training hours from 6 hours to 12 hours. And our center has always reimbursed staff for the cost of the trainings as well as their time. We value their time. They cannot do it in the workplace. You cannot do that. You take it outside you take it to your home, and you do it at night and on weekends and holidays. So it burdens our center. We're not going to be able to afford this anymore. We can't afford to pay our people additionally for the trainings that are required. So regulations need to be streamlined. As far as I'm concerned, I would suggest they streamline those background checks, streamline the required trainings. Keystone Stars is a wonderful program that's been around a long time now, and it has encouraged quality. And being a Star 4 center, we are quality, an early childhood facility that possesses all of the required standards to be a Star 4. And that, unfortunately, that costs more money for our staff. We have to pay more money towards the additional trainings. So it burdens us in many, many ways to be a quality Star 4 facility and to maintain that. Again, there's very little incentive to maintain that Star 4 rating. You do get some add-ons with your subsidized care, which are great. Our facility, unfortunately, has only about a 5% of our students are participating in subsidized care. 95% are not eligible, and that affects our food program as well. And I have a question for everyone, and just as a side note and another way of a solution. The child care food program industry, USDA, and the funding throughout the country has fed entire school districts free of charge. Do you know how much I receive for for a person who is paid by us fully? In other words, not free or reduced. I receive 92 cents per day to feed our students, of which are 95% are not eligible for free or reduced lunch. So there's just another way to assist child care centers in keeping the quality. That's part of the STARS program. Quality is providing that food. There are many ways that those quality centers can be reimbursed for the things they are currently doing.
And then Melanie asked, and are there models in other states that we might learn from? Jen, you talked about this a little bit earlier. If you could maybe elaborate on those responses for Melanie's question.
Sure. So what we found in other states is that a lot, and it doesn't matter, red, blue, purple, they are starting to invest in the staff, recognizing that to start addressing the crisis, we have to fix the staffing problem. And so there's a variety of ways of how they do that. Some programs, like I said, are doing this per month, payment to programs for their full-time equivalent employees. There are other special programs that focus around more around like the education and retention. And we used to have a similar award to that in Pennsylvania. Variety of ways. And we actually have a report on our website, startstrongpa.org, that you can check out that in those 18 states explains what they're doing. The other thing I'll point out is that other states are starting to pay or what we consider the real cost of care. That gets at some of the issues Gina is talking about.
Yes.
To make sure that, the cost of actually providing care, and to us, that would include an appropriate wage. Is paid to childcare programs. So there are other states that are a lot further ahead than us, and we are looking to them to kind of model things off of.
And we have a question from Bernice, who asked, does either presidential candidate offer any federal ideas regarding childcare in particular? Is there anything you're watching for, Jen?
I can share initially what we've seen. Former President Trump has noted childcare as an important issue publicly. It's something that I think the quote was something the country has to have. And in response to questions about making it more affordable, he has stated his plan to hike tariffs could help cover that cost. But we have not seen like a specific plan on that. Vice President Harris has talked about capping the cost for families for childcare at 7% of their income. That's similar to a prior proposal called Build Back Better. I think a lot of people on this webinar are familiar with. This cap actually exists currently for the subsidized program. That was just put in place by the federal government with a new rule they passed. So states will need to comply. Fortunately, in Pennsylvania, we've already done that. So kudos to the folks in state government in Pennsylvania to putting that cap in place prior. With pandemic related dollars to help those families, at least in the subsidized program. She's also talked about childcare providers should receive wages that they deserve, kind of reflected of their work, but no detail around, how to pay for it. So I think there's more to come probably from both candidates on the subject. We're glad to see they're both talking about it though, and that it's been raised in national debate.
And we got one of our live questions was, does federal and state money go to private religious-based childcare providers? Jen, if you can, explain what the answer is there. And
So, sure. So a religious provider can be part of the subsidized childcare program. So if they want to they choose to agree with the agreement with the Commonwealth, they can offer subsidized childcare and receive those payments for a child. As Gina noted, if you participate above the star 1 rating, you get a higher payment per day per child, recognizing the level of quality costs you more to offer. So yep, you can participate in that program if you're religiously affiliated.
And then can you briefly just explain for people, I think we have a lot of people familiar with it on this video tonight, but the subsidized childcare program, just broadly what that is, how it works. And it seems like a lot of the funding we're talking about goes through the subsidized childcare program.
Sure. So Pennsylvania's program is called Childcare Works. It helps low-income families afford childcare. You need to be working or in a combination of work and education and training. There's certain criteria you have to meet that way, and there are income criteria. So you can enter the program up to 200% of the federal poverty level, and stay in up to 300% of that level. I'll share some unmet needs statistics I think might be relevant. Pre-pandemic, we were serving about 114,000 children in the program. And at the worst point, that dropped to about 90,000. Fortunately, we're slowly seeing growth in the program. It's back up to around 96,000 children. But even when you look at that, one of our partners, Pennsylvania Partnerships for Children, runs data annually to kind of see how many families are eligible for this program and aren't accessing it. 71% of eligible children under age 5 who are eligible for this program aren't accessing it. That's about 119,000 kids. So it's another area we've talked a lot about. Like, we need to get the word out about it for those who are in fact eligible, to be able to access it so they can help pay, have an easier time paying for childcare. You do pay a co-payment as a parent. It's based on your family size and family income. But again, it's been capped at that 7%.
And Senator Schwenk, I think this issue has come up in budget hearings over the years. I mean, what's your thoughts about why that enrollment in that Childcare Works program has been dropped so much and has been slower to rebound?
Well, I definitely think as you look at, what happened with the pandemic, people may have made other arrangements, or it's simply just as Jen said, taking some time for it to be restored. There's kind of a hidden problem to this though, is that, something called we call a benefits cliff. You're getting subsidized childcare, and if you start to earn more, which we hope everybody can do, or you advance in your career, you will lose that subsidy. And then you find yourself in a situation where you have to pay more for childcare than you did in the past. I think that's something that we need to address as well, is that issue of sort of smoothing out that, that base from what subsidized is paying for and where you will be if you have to go to private care, private rate rather.
Ed, could I jump in for a minute?
Yeah, please go.
The other problem with all of this, the funding that's available for Childcare Works, is you can't find a program. You can't find an enrollment slot because they're full, because the staffing isn't there. I could serve, as I said, 40 more preschool age students if I had the staff, which would allow for more of the Childcare Works subsidized funding to be utilized. I spoke with our local ELRC director recently, and she shared, because I said to her, I'm telling parents, come to you. And she said, well, Gina, unfortunately, because of lack of staffing here, we don't have enough people to process all of the applications that are coming in. So there's a lot of issues here. Lack of staffing leads to lack of enrollment, And the people that do qualify for these programs simply cannot get their um, uh, applications processed in an expedient manner. So there's a lot of layers here.
And
And
I'll
then
make the case,
yeah.
I'm sorry, Ed, I'll make the case
ahead.
for those parents who do not qualify for subsidized care, but find that care is such a large part of their budget. Like somebody said, I think in the chat, that it's as much as a mortgage or maybe more. And it's just so difficult for families. And we want to see people, to advance in their communities in terms of if you wanted to rent a more expensive, house or something, or to buy a home. Those kinds of things are off the table for people who need to spend so much for childcare. People make the decision as to whether it's worth it to work or to have use childcare. And I just don't feel that it should be that way. Again, I think we're failing the people of our Commonwealth because we're not addressing this in a comprehensive way.
Okay. I think we can I think we're hitting time. I thank you all for your questions tonight. Thank you all my panelists for their great answers tonight. I want to thank everybody for being here on a Thursday evening. We appreciate the support for our work at Spotlight PA. You can read our journalism online at spotlightpa.org, and it's 7 o'clock, so have a wonderful evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.